The ink on the $200,000 bank loan was barely dry when Clara tore the contract in half. In a county where green and red diesel machines dictated your worth, she bet her family's entire legacy on 12 tons of raw, breathing muscle. They called her crazy. Then the pumps ran dry. The metallic screech of a blown transmission echoing across the Nebraska plains is a sound that can age a farmer 10 years in 10 seconds. For 38-year-old Clara Higgins, the owner of Copper Creek Farm, that sound meant the end of the line. Her 1998 Case IH combine, held together by duct tape, aftermarket parts, and sheer stubbornness, had finally died in the middle of a sparse winter wheat field. Smoke billowed from the engine compartment, carrying the acrid smell of burning oil and vaporized dreams. Clara sat in the dust-coated cab, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. The farm had been in her family for 4 generations, but the math was no longer adding up. Modern farming wasn't about dirt and rain anymore. It was about debt, diesel, and computer chips. 2 days later, Clara sat in the overly air-conditioned office of First National Bank in Ogallala. Across the mahogany desk sat Gregory Finch, a loan officer whose soft, uncalloused hands had never touched a plow, yet who held the power of life and death over the county's agricultural community. "I can approve you for $200,000, Clara," Gregory said, sliding a thick stack of paperwork across the desk. "It's enough for a decent-used John Deere S680 from Gary Walsh's dealership. It's a 5-year note. But you have to understand, with your current margins, one bad yield, one major mechanical failure, or one spike in fuel prices, and the bank takes Copper Creek. No extensions." Clara stared at the contract. $200,000 for a machine with 6,000 engine hours on it. A machine that required proprietary software just to diagnose a sensor failure. A machine that burned 15 gallons of diesel an hour. She left the bank with the pre-approval letter burning a hole in her pocket and drove straight to Walsh Implement and Tractor. The lot was a sea of shiny green and yellow steel. Gary Walsh, a man who smelled perpetually of cheap cologne and engine degreaser, clapped her on the shoulder. "She's a beauty, Clara," Gary boasted, patting the massive tire of the S680. "Got the new GPS tracking, automated yield mapping. Only problem is the DEF fluid system is a little finicky, and if the main computer board goes out, which they do, you're looking at a 6-month wait for parts from Germany. But hey, that's modern farming, right?" Clara looked at the towering machine. It didn't look like salvation. It looked like a metal parasite. She did the mental math. 200 grand for the combine, another 40 grand a year in diesel fuel just to run it. 10 grand in specialized maintenance. The margins were so razor-thin they were practically transparent. She was literally signing her family's blood away to feed a diesel-drinking monster that could be bricked by a faulty microchip. That night, sitting at her grandfather's scarred oak dining table, Clara opened a dusty, leather-bound ledger from 1934. It was her great-grandfather's farm journal. Amidst the elegant cursive detailing crop rotations and weather patterns, she found a meticulously kept ledger of feed, harness repairs, and veterinary bills for a team of draft horses. The numbers were staggering in their simplicity. The farm had run entirely on grass, oats, and muscle. A crazy, dangerous, magnificent idea began to take root in Clara's mind. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had found in the back of an obscure agricultural magazine. The phone rang for a long time before a gruff voice answered. "Ezekiel Yoder speaking." Ezekiel was a prominent draft horse breeder in the heart of Ohio's Amish country. Clara didn't mince words. Mr. Yoda, I need a team, a big one. I'm looking to pull ground drive farming equipment, and I need horses that know how to work from dawn till dusk." "How many head?" Ezekiel asked, his tone skeptical. 12, Clara said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I want the biggest, strongest Clydesdales you have, and I need the harnesses and the antique ground drive equipment to match." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. 12 Clydesdales is a lot of horse for a modern farmer, ma'am. That's 12 tons of muscle. They don't have an ignition switch. They bleed, they sweat, and they have minds of their own. "I know," Clara replied, looking at the unsigned bank contract on her table. "How much for the entire package?" $65,000. Delivered. Clara hung up the phone. She had just saved $135,000. But as she stared out into the pitch-black Nebraska night, she knew the hardest part wasn't buying the horses. It was going to be surviving the ridicule of a town that worshipped at the altar of the internal combustion engine. The arrival of the livestock haulers on a crisp Tuesday morning did not go unnoticed. In a town like Ogallala, secrets have a shorter lifespan than a mayfly. Instead of a flatbed delivering a shiny green combine, 2 massive aluminum trailers backed into the dirt driveway of Copper Creek Farm. The heavy metal ramps dropped with a resounding crash, and out stepped the giants. 12 magnificent Clydesdales, each standing nearly 18 hands high and weighing close to 2,000 pounds. Their massive hooves, adorned with thick white feathers, struck the Nebraska dirt like thunder. They were magnificent primal beasts, creatures of deep chests, Roman noses, and immense coiled power. By noon, word had spread. By 2 p.m., Clara's driveway was lined with pickup trucks. Leading the pack of onlookers was her cousin, Bradley Higgins. Bradley owned Wade Higgins Ag Corp., a massive 5,000-acre corporate farm that swallowed up family plots every time a local went bankrupt. Bradley drove a lifted Ford F250 he wrote off as a business expense and wore pristine cowboy boots that had never stepped in manure. He leaned against the wooden fence, a condescending smirk plastered across his face as Clara led a massive bay gelding named Samson into the pasture. "Well, I'll be damned," Bradley laughed, his voice loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. "I heard you lost your mind, Clara, but I didn't think you went back to the 1800s. What's next? You gonna start churning your own butter by candlelight?" A few of the local farmers chuckled, shaking their heads. "You got a 600-acre harvest coming up in 5 months, Bradley continued, taking off his sunglasses. "You can't harvest commercial wheat with a petting zoo. When you go bankrupt this fall, I'll buy this land at auction for pennies on the dollar. I'll even let you keep a couple of these ponies for the county fair." Clara didn't flinch. She unclipped Samson's lead rope and turned to face her cousin. "At least when my tractor breaks down, Bradley, it can heal itself, and it runs on the oats I grow, not the diesel you're up to your eyeballs in debt to buy." Bradley scoffed, spitting a wad of sunflower seeds into the dirt. "Good luck, Clara. You're gonna need it." The crowd dispersed, but the reality of Clara's decision quickly set in. Buying the horses was a financial triumph. Running them was a logistical nightmare. The first major blow came the very next morning. Clara walked into the barn at 4:30 a.m. to find her 2 hired farm hands, Tyler and Jesse, packing their duffel bags. Both were in their early 20s, guys who loved the air-conditioned cabs and Bluetooth stereos of modern tractors. "Sorry, Clara," Tyler muttered, looking down at his boots. "We hired on to drive machines, not scoop horse crap and get kicked by dinosaurs. We got offers from Bradley. He's paying $20 an hour to sit in an S-Series combine." "Fine," Clara said, her voice tight. Leave the keys to the bunkhouse on the table. She was alone. 12 horses, 600 acres, and no crew. Desperation led her to the door of Harrison Cole. Harrison was a 68-year-old recluse who lived on the edge of town. Decades ago, he had been a legendary teamster, competing in heavy horse pulls across the Midwest before a tractor rollover shattered his hip and drove him into early retirement. He was notoriously bitter and hated modern farm equipment. Clara found him sitting on his porch, whittling a piece of cedar. She pitched him her plan. Harrison stared at her with piercing blue eyes. "You want to pull a 6-horse hitch to run a ground-drive binder and thresher?" he rasped. "You're a fool, little girl. It'll break your back. It'll break your spirit. And those horses will drag you through the mud if you don't know how to command them." "Then teach me," Clara challenged, throwing a pair of heavy leather driving lines onto his porch. "Or sit here and watch Bradley Higgins turn this whole county into a sterile corporate parking lot." Harrison looked at the leather lines, then at Clara's determined face. A slow, grim smile crept across his weathered features. "Work starts at 4 a.m. If you're late, I'm gone." The next 3 months were a crucible of pain, sweat, and steep learning curves. Clara learned that driving a 6-horse team was like trying to steer a freight train with shoelaces. It required immense physical strength, spatial awareness, and a deep, intuitive connection with the animals. Her hands became covered in agonizing, weeping blisters from the heavy leather lines. Her shoulders ached so badly she could barely lift her arms to wash her hair at night. There were disasters, like the Tuesday when a young mare named Duchess got spooked by a low-flying crop duster, tangling the harness and nearly overturning a heavy steel disc harrow, dragging Clara 30 yards through the dirt. But slowly, painfully, magic began to happen. The massive animals learned her voice. They learned the subtle shifts in tension on the lines. Under Harrison's barking tutelage, the chaos turned into a rhythmic, powerful ballet of muscle and steel. The antique ground drive equipment, refurbished by Amish blacksmiths, worked flawlessly. While Bradley's tractors compacted the soil into concrete slabs, the Clydesdales stepped lightly, their manure naturally fertilizing the earth as they worked. Yet the town's mockery didn't stop. At Sally's diner, the morning coffee crowd made it a daily ritual to take bets on what day Clara would finally default on her property taxes. They called Copper Creek the museum. Gary Walsh hung a picture of a Clydesdale in his dealership with a target drawn over it, a joke about the competition. Clara ignored them, pouring every ounce of her energy into her horses and her crops. She used the remaining money from her unspent bank loan to build massive, weatherproof silos, stockpiling thousands of bushels of high-quality oats to feed her team through the winter. Summer turned to late August. Harvest season was just 4 weeks away. The golden wheat swayed in the wind, a bumper crop that could clear Clara's remaining debts, if she could harvest it in time. Then, on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, the world outside Ogallala shattered. Clara and Harrison were sitting in Sally's diner, eating meatloaf specials after a grueling morning of harness repairs. The diner was packed with local farmers, including Bradley, who was loudly bragging about the 50,000 gallons of diesel he had pre-ordered for his fleet of combines. Suddenly, the diner's television, usually tuned to a muffled sports channel, flashed red with a breaking news banner. The low hum of conversation in the room abruptly died out. The news anchor's face was grave. A coordinated cyber attack, originating from an unknown foreign entity, had successfully breached the central control systems of the 3 largest fuel pipelines in North America. Simultaneously, A geopolitical crisis in the Middle East had triggered an immediate, devastating embargo on crude oil exports. Federal authorities are warning of unprecedented disruptions, the anchor reported, her voice tight with panic. Emergency rationing protocols are being implemented nationwide. Commercial diesel reserves are expected to be depleted within 48 hours. Prices have already surged past $9 a gallon on the spot market, but officials warn that supply, not price, will be the critical issue. Effective immediately, agricultural fuel deliveries are suspended indefinitely. A deafening silence fell over Sally's diner. The only sound was the clinking of a single coffee cup against a saucer. Clara slowly turned her head to look at Bradley. The smug, arrogant grin had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a pale, chalky mask of absolute horror. His 5,000 acres of wheat were about to be ready. His multi-million-dollar fleet of John Deere S-Series combines were sitting in his massive barns, hungry, complex beasts that required thousands of gallons of a liquid that simply no longer existed. Clara took a sip of her coffee, set a $10 bill on the table, and looked at Harrison. "Well, Harrison," she said quietly, the faint trace of a smile touching her lips, "I think it's time to go feed the tractors." Within 48 hours of the news broadcast, Ogallala, Nebraska, transformed from a bustling agricultural hub into a mechanical graveyard. The initial panic at the pumps devolved into absolute despair as the reality of the government mandates set in. All remaining diesel reserves were federally seized for emergency services and military use. Agricultural operations were deemed non-essential until further notice. The silence that fell over the county was deafening. September arrived, bringing with it the dry, crisp air of harvest season. Across thousands of acres, millions of dollars worth of winter wheat stood golden and ready. Yet the massive John Deere S68 Ohus and Case YH combines sat paralyzed in their metal sheds, useless monuments to a fragile era. At Copper Creek Farm, however, the silence was broken by the rhythmic, thunderous thud of 24 massive hooves. Clara Higgins and Harrison Cole were already in the fields at dawn. The air was thick with the scent of crushed stalks and horse sweat. Clara stood on the steel platform of a fully restored 1930s McCormick Deering ground drive binder, the heavy leather lines wrapped securely around her calloused hands. Ahead of her, the 6-horse hitch, led by Samson and Duchess, leaned into their massive leather collars, pulling the heavy implement with an unstoppable, relentless momentum. The ground drive system was a marvel of mechanical engineering that required not a single drop of fossil fuel. As the heavy iron wheels of the binder rolled across the earth, their rotation engaged a series of heavy chains and gears, powering the oscillating sickle bar that sliced through the thick wheat. The machine gathered the cut stalks, bundled them perfectly, and tied them with twine, dropping the golden sheaves onto the field to be collected for the thresher. It was grueling, physical work. Clara's muscles screamed by midday, and she was coated in a thick layer of chaff and dust. But as she looked across the fence line at Bradley's property, she saw nothing but still, silent rot. His wheat was beginning to lodge, falling over from its own weight, and birds were feasting on the vulnerable grain. Desperation in Ogallala soon turned toxic. By the second week of September, the black market for diesel had exploded. Men who had once debated grain futures at Sally's Diner were now whispering about siphoning fuel from abandoned railway locomotives. The tension culminated on a moonless Thursday night. Clara was awakened by the frantic barking of Buster, her blue heeler. She threw on her boots, grabbed the heavy Winchester lever-action rifle from behind her bedroom door, and sprinted toward the grain silos where she stored her oat reserves. A rusted Chevrolet pickup was idling near the silos, its headlights off. Two men were frantically trying to hook a portable auger to the base of her grain bin. Oats, the very fuel that kept Clara's farm alive, had become a highly valuable barter commodity on the black market. "Step away from the auger!" Clara yelled, racking the lever of the Winchester. The metallic clack echoed like a cannon shot in the quiet night. A spotlight flicked on from the barn loft, blinding the intruders. Harrison stood up there, a 12-gauge shotgun resting casually on the window ledge. The men froze. As Clara's eyes adjusted, she recognized the trembling figure holding the auger tube. It was Gary Walsh, the arrogant owner of the local implement dealership. His expensive cologne was masked by the stench of stale sweat and sheer panic. "Clara." "Please," Gary stammered, raising his hands. "My dealership is bankrupt. The bank froze my accounts. I just need enough oats to trade to a guy in North Platte for 10 gallons of gas so I can get my family to Omaha." Clara stared at the man who had mocked her, who had hung a target over a picture of her horses. The rage in her chest battled with a deep, aching pity. "Leave the auger, Gary," Clara said, her voice dropping to an icy calm. "Get in your truck. If you ever set foot on Copper Creek again, Harrison won't bother with a warning shot." Gary scrambled into his truck and sped off into the darkness. Clara leaned against the cold steel of the silo, her heart pounding. The world was falling apart, and her 12 Clydesdales were the only thing holding her small corner of it together. By the 3rd week of the crisis, Copper Creek Farm was a beacon of productivity in a county paralyzed by silence. Clara's massive silos were filling rapidly, the golden grain cascading into the bins like a waterfall of pure survival. The antique thresher, a magnificent clattering beast of belts, gears, and pulleys, hummed along flawlessly. Harrison had rigged a custom horse treadmill system, allowing a rotating pair of Clydesdales to power the stationary machine while the others rested. It was an exhausting, brutal physical rhythm, but Copper Creek was the only farm within a 50-mile radius successfully bringing in a crop. The irony was palpable. The modern world had ground to a halt, yet the 19th century heartbeat of Clara's farm was stronger than ever. Then came the morning. Clara found a lifted Ford F250 parked awkwardly at the end of her dirt driveway. It hadn't been driven there. It had been pushed. The engine was dead, the tank bone dry. Walking up the long, dusty road toward the barn was her cousin, Bradley Higgins. He looked absolutely nothing like the corporate titan who had mocked her in the spring. He had lost at least 15 pounds. His expensive designer cowboy boots were scuffed and coated in dried mud, his face pale, deeply lined, and covered in a patchy, uneven beard. He stood silently by the wooden corral fence, watching with hollow eyes as Clara unharnessed the massive frames of Goliath and Samson after a grueling morning run. "The bank called yesterday," Bradley finally spoke, his voice cracking, devoid of its usual booming arrogance. "Gregory Finch, he told me they're calling in the loans, Clara. All of them. The combines, the seed debt, the land. Everything. The federal moratorium on foreclosures doesn't apply to commercial ag loans of my size. They're liquidating." Clara continued brushing Samson's sweat-slicked flank, the stiff bristles making a rhythmic shh, shh sound. She didn't look up. "I warned you about leverage, Bradley. You built an empire on a liquid you couldn't control, and you sold your soul to a bank that doesn't care if you starve. I have 5,000 acres of prime winter wheat dying in the field," Bradley pleaded, stepping closer to the fence, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the top rail. "It's lodging. The birds are destroying it. The rot is setting in. Please, I'll pay you whatever you want. I'll give you 50% of the yield. I'll sign over my trucks. Just bring the horses over. Bring the binders. Help me save my farm." Clara stopped brushing. She turned and looked at her cousin. This was the man who had publicly humiliated her in front of the town, who had poached her hired hands, and who had eagerly plotted to buy her family's legacy for pennies at a bankruptcy auction. "I don't want your money, Bradley," Clara said quietly, her voice carrying the cold, hard edge of a winter wind. "Because your money is about to be entirely worthless if this county can't eat." She reached into her heavy canvas jacket, pulled out a folded topographical map of the county, and spread it flat over the top rail of the fence. She tapped her calloused, blistered finger on a specific 400-acre parcel bordering the eastern edge of Copper Creek. "This is the original Higgins family homestead," Clara stated, looking him dead in the eye. "The exact plot of land your father forced my father to sell under duress during the farm crisis in the 80s. If you want my horses to save your neck, here are my terms. The land. You will deed this specific 400-acre parcel back to me, free and clear, today, in front of a notary. 10. The labor. 12 horses cannot harvest 5,000 acres before the first hard freeze. It's mathematically impossible. We will save what we can. But you will provide the physical labor. The horses can work in shifts, but Harrison and I have to sleep. You will bring your crew. The command. You and your men will work the lines under our strict command. No arguments, no complaints. If you mistreat my animals, the deal is off instantly." Bradley stared at this map. It was total capitulation. It was extortion, plain and simple, tearing away a massive chunk of his prized estate. But it was the absolute only lifeline he had left in a drowning world. He closed his eyes, swallowed hard, and slowly nodded. Deal. The very next afternoon, Bradley arrived at Copper Creek with 4 exhausted men. Among them were Tyler and Jesse, Clara's former farmhands who had abandoned her for air-conditioned combine cabs. They stared at the dirt, deeply ashamed, as Clara silently handed them thick, unyielding leather work gloves. "There are no Bluetooth stereos out here, boys," Harrison barked from the barn door, tossing a massive 80-pound leather harness collar squarely into Tyler's chest, forcing the young man to stumble backward. "You listen to the horses, or you'll end up crushed under a steel wheel. You're not mechanics anymore. You're teamsters. Let's move." The final 2 weeks of September morphed into a frantic, agonizing marathon against the impending Nebraska winter. Clara's farm became the undisputed epicenter of the county's desperate survival. They worked around the clock in grueling 12-hour shifts. When the sun went down, they utilized battery-powered headlamps to harvest through the frigid, pitch-black nights. The massive Clydesdales became local legends. Their immense muscles strained against the heavy leather traces, their thick winter coats frothed with white sweat. But they never once faltered. They were fed on the very oats they were actively harvesting. A perfect, unbroken, self-sustaining circle of raw energy that no cyber attack could ever shut down. When First National Bank eventually dispatched Gregory Finch to officially serve Bradley with foreclosure papers, the loan officer's hybrid sedan ran out of its meager battery charge 2 miles down the road. Finch was forced to walk in his expensive Italian leather shoes through thick, muddy ruts, only to find a shocking scene. Bradley Higgins, the arrogant corporate farmer, was completely covered in black grease, dirt, and chaff, manually pitching heavy sheaves of wheat into the antique thresher alongside Clara and Harrison. The sheer volume of grain they had managed to frantically harvest and process was enough to satisfy the bank's immediate margin calls, effectively stalling the foreclosure. By the time the first heavy, brutal blizzard swept across the plains in late October, freezing the earth solid under 2 feet of snow, Clara Higgins had not only saved Copper Creek, she had doubled its size and secured its future for a century. She stood on her wraparound front porch, wrapped tightly in a thick wool blanket, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. The county was still largely silent, the electrical grid sputtering and diesel fuel still heavily rationed by the military. Across the road, Bradley's remaining giant green combines were buried under massive snowdrifts, looking exactly like the fossilized skeletons of extinct dinosaurs. From the warmth of the reinforced barn behind her, Clara could hear the deep, rhythmic breathing and the occasional heavy stomp of 12 giant Clydesdales. They were the undeniable heartbeat of Copper Creek. The world had rushed blindly forward into a fragile, digital future, arrogantly forgetting the resilient strength of the past. Clara had bet everything she had on blood, bone, and tradition. They had laughed at her until they were blue in the face. But as Clara looked out over her newly reclaimed family land, the only sound left on the biting winter wind was the quiet, undeniable hum of total victory. If Clara's incredible journey from the laughingstock of Ogallala to the savior of Copper Creek Farm inspired you, don't keep this story to yourself. Hit that like button, share this video with friends who appreciate true grit, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life stories of rural survival and triumph. Your support helps us bring these powerful tales to light. Drop a comment below on what you would have done in Clara's shoes. See you next time.